Homework 14, hopefully quite straightforward. We have 7 lines of pseudocode, all with different programming constructs in use, and this is all about kind of identifying the different types of uses of the different constructs that we have. So right away, the first question is about procedures and functions, and it asks you to identify which is in use in this. So some differences between functions and procedures. A procedure does not need a return value, whereas a function must have a return value. Both capable of a function must have at least one input parameter, whereas a procedure doesn't actually require any parameters at all. So functions have at least one input and only one output, one return value, whereas a procedure requires no input parameters and it doesn't return any values either. Question 2 asks you how many parameters the above mentioned procedure or function uses. So I'll give you a hint. If you look at line 4, we always include the parameters in brackets separated by commas, so you can identify how many different parameters that this code is using. Question 3 is about global versus local scope variables. So local scope variables only exist within the procedure or function that they are created in. So this is actually quite a confusing question, because the answer, if you look, the variables are different names, so people would get confused. Now the local variables all exist only in the code in lines 4 to 7, and those variables would give you errors if you tried to access them out with those lines of code, whereas the global variables can be accessed in any sub-procedure. I like to think of global variables as having a passport, which allows them to be accessed in any sub-procedure at all. It's not good programming practice to have global variables. Just try and avoid them as much as possible, and local variables are much better because they allow us to completely remove sub-procedures and functions from our code without breaking other parts, and put them in to other programs with minimal changes required. So global variables are able to be accessed in any sub-procedure, so we've got to be careful because they could also accidentally be changed in that sub-procedure. And local variables, those can only be accessed within the sub-procedure which they are created in. So lines 4 to 7 is where you want to look to find out about local variables. And if you're still struggling to understand, you have that fantastic book resource that you can have a bit more of a read. Question 5 is about definitions of things that you are all familiar with and maybe not too great at explaining just yet. So abstraction is what you do every time we start a new problem. It is where we take the mess of the problem and we remove all the parts that are unnecessary and don't help us at all, so we can focus on only the parts of the problem that are relevant. So it's removing irrelevant information from the scenario and focusing on the parts that matter. What is an algorithm? Well, hopefully you guys know a couple of different ways to at least plan algorithms, and those are using pseudocode and flowcharts. And an algorithm is basically a list of steps that, if you follow them in order, will achieve the solution to some particular problem. Decomposition is where you take a very large problem and you break it down into smaller, more manageable pieces, which you can then again break down into smaller, more manageable pieces again. Now, if you were looking for better definitions for these, the class book has much more detailed answers that you can look at for those. 6A to F are all about identifying different constructs again, so it's really important that we know the correct terminology for all of these. So hopefully you know initialization is where we give a variable its initial value, which we always do at step 0 to create our variables right at the top of the screen, so that it's easy to kind of know where they all should be and understand the variables that are used in the program. So this particular one is asking you to identify string variable initialization, so hopefully you can spot the difference between the two variables initialized on lines 2 and 3. Iteration is achieved by loops. Now we know there's two types, there's fixed and there's conditional. So see if you can spot the line that a particular loop begins on. Now usually in the exam it will be pseudocode rather than code, so look for the start of the loop and the end of the loop and write the range that the code starts and ends on. Predefined function, identify the line which makes use of that. So we know several predefined functions that give the length, for example, of a string, or to set variables to upper and lower case. So see if you can spot which line of code we have a predefined function on that we've used before. 6D, I've already given the answer away pretty much with answering question 1, but where does the function or procedure begin? Selection is the one that perhaps I'm not too familiar with, because for us, when we do selection, we would say an if statement, as in it selects the branch that it wants to execute based on whether conditions are true or not. And F, internal commentary, usually identified by a hashtag or often the 3 inverted commas in a row to cover a span of text.